Good evening. I'm Judy Woodruff on the NewsHour tonight.
It's the largest tax cut in the history of our country.
Republicans passed the most drastic rewrite of the tax code in 30 years, sending the $1.5 trillion plan to the president's desk. Then the high cost of victory in Iraq. A new casualty count reveals thousands of civilians died in the battle to push ISIS out of Mosul, a number far higher than previously reported. And the link between housing and health. A look at a program that is relocating families out of poverty-stricken neighborhoods for a new life. Plus, a new play is giving music lovers something to sing about. Jeffrey Brown talks with the cast and writers of The Band's Visit about a hapless Egyptian group in Israel.
It's about taking little risks, and it's also about how music and art are bigger connectors than just language alone.
All that and more on tonight's PBS NewsHour. It is a done deal. Congressional Republicans today pushed their sweeping tax bill across the finish line. Then they partied with the president. Lisa Desjardins begins our coverage.
Hasn't been done in 34 years, but actually really hasn't been done because we broke every record. It's the largest tax cut in the history of our country.
For President Trump and governing Republicans, a White House victory lap today after scoring their first sweeping legislative win.
$3.2 trillion, just think of it, in tax cuts for American families, including doubling the standard deduction and doubling the child tax credit.
Final passage of the tax code overhaul came after the bill hurdled last-minute roadblocks. House Republicans first passed it yesterday, but Senate Republicans had to drop 3 provisions which violated the budget rules governing the process. Chants of "kill the bill" temporarily drowned out senators as they moved to the vote after midnight. It passed with all Republicans voting yes, all Democrats voting no, and Vice President Pence presiding.
The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act is passed.
Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell brushed off the bill's low ratings as temporary.
If we can't sell this to the American people, we ought to go into another line of work. I think this is an important accomplishment for the country that people will value and appreciate.
On this vote.
Then today, the truly final vote came in the House, and with it, another eruption of applause.
Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Next, perhaps the largest lawmaker caravan in history took Republicans to the White House by bus. As for Democrats, leaders Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi warned that the bill will haunt the GOP.
Now we know they're popping champagne down Pennsylvania Avenue. There are only 2 places where America is popping champagne: the White House and the corporate boardrooms, including Trump Tower.
Insulting crumbs they give working families are meager and temporary. The tax breaks for corporate America are vast and permanent.
As for the bill's cost, estimated to be $1.5 trillion by nonpartisan analysts, Republicans have insisted that will be paid for by growth. But today, House Speaker Paul Ryan was asked if the growth will be enough to cover that cost. He responded,
"Nobody knows the answer to that question because that's in the future. But what we do know is that this will increase economic growth."
White House officials, including Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin, have said the plan will, quote, pay for itself.
So we have a few questions for Lisa, but first, here's a reminder of the main changes that this bill will bring about. The corporate tax rate drops substantially from 35% to 21%. Most individuals will see income tax cuts, but less dramatic, and those expire in 2026. The standard deduction doubles for most households. State and local tax deductions remain, but they are limited to $10,000. And it repeals the individual health insurance mandate that was part of the Affordable Care Act. President Trump is expected to sign the tax bill into law next week. And Lisa, you've been looking at some of the other policy shifts in this tax bill. Let's talk about that. Step back and let's look at how does it change our priorities?
Right, I'm so happy to have this conversation. First, the business focus that Republicans have here. It seems like it's part of DNA for Republicans, but look at it historically. This shift is to a top rate for corporations that is the lowest since before World War II. And also it changes the conversation. This is a key debate. Republicans see helping business owners as something that helps everyone. Democrats see that as helping the wealthy. Here, Republicans have kind of shifted the policy direction there. Another one, Judy, that I haven't heard talked about much, traditional families. This bill actually does a great deal for traditional families. One, we know the child tax credit is doubled in this bill, but something that hasn't gotten much attention is alimony. This bill would reverse the way alimony deductions work. Right now, someone who pays alimony can take a deduction for that. This bill would change that starting in 2019 so that the deduction would only go to the person receiving alimony. You know, and this isn't just me noticing this. Speaker Paul Ryan talked about these issues and about the idea of sort of increasing childbirth rates just a couple weeks or last week. Here's a listen.
This is going to be the new economic challenge for America. People. Baby boomers are retiring. I did my part, but you know, we need to have higher birth rates in this country. Meaning, baby boomers are retiring, and we have fewer people following them in the workforce.
And so it's definitely something you see in this bill.
Pushing toward marriage and families.
Right.
It also affects some things that we buy and sell, like housing.
Right. There's a housing cool down in this bill, not just talking about the state and local property tax deductions, which are lowered, so you would actually pay more taxes on high-priced properties, but it actually, the mortgage deduction goes down as well. So new properties sold over $750,000, you wouldn't get that interest deduction. And I spoke to real estate agents today who think that will affect buying and selling of properties.
So let's talk, Lisa, a little bit about how this is implemented exactly. Go over exactly when it goes into effect.
All right, so everyone says January 1st, but what does that mean? It means income earned after January 1st will be taxed under this new law. Income earned this year, taxed under the old law. So you're filing your taxes in April, what's that mean? It's the old law. The first time your tax form will see these changes will be the next year, 2019.
And so we are 11 days away from January 1st. Employers and others, the IRS, have got to scramble at this point to get everything in order.
Right. They have to withhold income based on this new tax law. So here's a statement from the IRS that they gave me today on how they're looking at this. They say, we anticipate the initial withholding guidance in January, and that should allow taxpayers, they say, to see benefits of this change as early as February. Judy, that guidance usually goes out early December. So it's over a month late. Now that's a problem for those who handle payrolls. We got a letter from the American Payroll Association as well. They say this is a Herculean task. However, one bright spot, Judy, talking to them today, they say the conference report actually gives more flexibility. They feel like it's gotten a little easier to handle this task.
So some of it being delayed, but what does this mean for these final days of 2017 for people?
Well, charities are sending out notices to people to say, if you want to give more now, because fewer people will deduct the charitable deduction next year because the standard deduction doubles. So they think more people should give money now if you're willing to. The other issue, Judy, is property taxes. If you pay high property taxes, you should ask your local assessor if you can pay next year's taxes early, because that may be a benefit. You might be able to take a deduction now that closes next year.
So that means focusing on something other than the holidays.
Unfortunately, yes, that's when this is hitting.
A major tax bill. Lisa Desjardins, thank you. And in the day's other news, Congress worked on a spending bill to keep the government running through mid-January. It has to pass by Friday night to avoid a shutdown. Remaining issues include funding for a children's health insurance program and continued authority for overseas wiretapping of terror suspects. A political battle involving Virginia's state legislature has come down to a tie after Democrat Shelley Simons had been told that she'd won by one vote. A panel of judges ruled today that she and Republican David Yancey are dead even. The winner will be chosen by drawing names from a bowl. A Simons win could shift control of the Virginia House of Delegates and boost Democratic hopes for next year's congressional elections. The European Union took the unprecedented step today of censuring Poland for overhauling its justice system. The country's ruling rightist party has moved to take greater control of Polish courts. In Brussels, the EU's executive body charged that the changes threaten the rule of law and could trigger sanctions.
Executive or legislative powers are now set up in such a way that the ruling majority can systematically politically interfere with the composition, the powers, the administration and the functioning of these authorities, thereby rendering the independence of the judiciary completely moot.
Poland's president was undeterred. Hours after the EU announcement, he signed the last of the new laws, completing the transformation of the judicial system. 92 Somalis are accusing U.S. immigration agents of gross mistreatment during a botched deportation move this month. They say they spent nearly 48 hours shackled on an airplane before ultimately being returned to the U.S. A class action lawsuit charges that immigration agents, quote, kicked, struck, choked, and dragged the detainees. A federal judge has blocked any new deportation effort until next month. A federal judge in Nevada declared a mistrial today in the Cliven Bundy case. Bundy, 2 sons, and a militia leader are accused of leading an armed standoff with federal agents over a cattle grazing dispute. The judge ruled that prosecutors failed to disclose all their evidence to the defense. The ride-hailing service Uber has suffered a major legal loss. The European Union's top court ruled today that the company should be regulated as a taxi service and not a tech company. Taxi drivers in Barcelona, Spain celebrated the decision. They had accused Uber of engaging in unfair competition, and they sued to bar it from doing business in their city.
Well, I'm very happy. We are hopeful. We have achieved a great victory. We have managed to get Uber, a multinational company, to kneel before a group of taxi drivers who in the past, 4 years ago, managed to stop the service here in Spain, and now we have stopped it all over Europe, which is very important.
Uber played down the ruling and said it might affect operations in only 4 countries. Back in this country, crews battling the Thomas Fire in Southern California were on guard today against a return of gusting winds. The wildfire is now 60% contained after calm weather the past 2 days, but hundreds of evacuees may not be able to return home for Christmas. South Carolina's capital has become the first U.S. city to ban the use of bump stocks, devices that allow semi-automatic rifles to fire like full automatics. The Columbia City Council took the step last night. Members cited the Las Vegas sniper who used a bump stock to kill 58 people in October. The New York Times says that it is reassigning White House reporter Glenn Thrush after investigating allegations of sexual misconduct. In a statement, the paper says that Thrush acted offensively but does not deserve to be fired. Instead, he will stay on suspension for 2 months before getting a new assignment. On Wall Street today, the Dow Jones Industrial Average lost 28 points to close at 24,726. The Nasdaq fell 2 points, and the S&P 500 also slipped 2. And the disgraced former Archbishop of Boston, Cardinal Bernard Law, died today at a hospital in Rome. For years, he was a leading figure in the Roman Catholic Church in the U.S., but he resigned in 2002 after the Boston Globe exposed a cover-up of decades of priests molesting children. His funeral mass will be at St. Peter's Basilica tomorrow. Cardinal Bernard Law was 86 years old. Still to come on the NewsHour, the tax bill's repeal of the Obamacare individual mandate. A stunning new civilian death toll in the fight to retake an ISIS stronghold. When moving from one neighborhood to another can improve your health, and much more. We return to the tax bill that Congress voted to pass along party lines today. The reach of the measure extends beyond what you file with the IRS to health care. John Yang has more on that.
Judy, the bill repeals the penalties levied on individuals if they do not have health insurance coverage, the so-called individual mandate. That takes effect in 2019. President Trump says that repeals the Affordable Care Act.
So in this bill, not only do we have massive tax cuts and tax reform, we have essentially repealed Obamacare, and we'll come up with something that will be much better, whether it's block grants or whether it's taking what we have and doing something terrific. But Obamacare has been repealed in this bill.
Here to discuss this and other health care issues facing Congress is Julie Rovner. She's chief Washington correspondent for Kaiser Health News, which we should note is not affiliated with Kaiser Permanente. Julie, you heard what the president said. Is he right? Is this effectively repealing the Affordable Care Act?
Not really. I think, he's been saying this. He's been saying that it's dead, and most of my colleagues have been describing it as bruised, battered, beaten up, but not dead yet. The individual mandate was important, but is not the only piece of the law, nor, I think, these days, people are saying it's not even the most important piece of the law. That may well be the requirement for insurers to cover people with pre-existing conditions or the expansion of Medicaid. That's where most of the enrollment growth has come from.
Well, we've got a graphic. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that 13 million more people will be without insurance over the next 10 years because of this, what Congress did, and that premiums will go up 10% or more in most years. Now, what's the connection between those two things?
Well, the concern has been from the insurance companies that if healthy people aren't required, have some sort of requirement to have coverage, that they'll wait until they get sick to sign up, so that only sick people will have insurance. We're talking now about the individual market, the market where people buy their own coverage. It's somewhere around 17 million people total. And the insurers said that that's why they needed this individual mandate. So without the individual mandate, they say, we will have only sick people. They will be required basically to raise their premiums or else lose money, and that's where that comes in. So what the CBO says is that there'll be a combination of people who will no longer have coverage. Some of them will be the ones that the Republicans talk about, the people who were only buying coverage because they were required to or else face a fine. Some of them, says the CBO, will be people who will now be priced out of coverage because the insurers are going to raise their premiums. And finally, some of them will be people who live in areas where there won't be any more insurers. Those will likely be rural areas where there are more Republicans than Democrats.
You seem to be describing a body blow to the Affordable Care Act.
Oh yes, it's something that's serious. It's not necessarily a complete repeal or even a fully taking apart of the law. What the CBO has said is that they expect in most parts of the country, even without the requirement, most individual insurance markets would remain what they call stable.
Now, there have been two bills moving through, really the Senate, to try to stabilize the individual market under the Affordable Care Act. One would fund the plan's cost-sharing reduction payments. The other would create a pool of money to help insurance companies pay claims for the sickest policyholders. Just this afternoon, they said these are not going to be acted on before they go home for Christmas. What's the future for these two bills?
Well, it's still pretty unclear. Senator Susan Collins rather famously said that she would vote for the tax bill only if they did these two bills, which it now looks like they're not going to do, at least not this year. One of them, actually the second one, what's called the reinsurance bill, that would give insurers more money to help pay for their sickest patients, that one most analysts think would be fairly significant, although there's not a whole lot of money in that bill. But if they actually did it right, that could contain premiums from going up. The other bill is a little more complicated. This will restore these subsidies that the president cut off in October. But really, since then, a combination of state regulators and the insurance companies have figured out ways that most people are being held harmless. Insurance companies are being paid back. The only people who are really being hit by this are people who don't get help paying for their subsidies. Those people are paying higher premiums. But even then, some of them have been protected if they buy the right kind of plan.
The Senate Majority Leader has promised to vote on these, but the Speaker of the House has not. Is this, are they trying to have this collapse of its own weight, the Affordable Care Act?
Well, the Republicans in the House have been saying all along they don't want to do anything that stabilizes this. They want the Affordable Care Act to fall apart. So why would they want to vote for something that could make this less of a body blow? They wanted to do this because they wanted it to be a body blow.
Quickly to the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIP, very popular program, bipartisan support. Funding ran out at the end of September, and they still have not reauthorized it. There's a study out today from the Georgetown University Health Policy Initiative saying that about 2 million children are at risk of losing coverage by the end of January, another 1 million by the end of February. Why is Congress having such a hard time keeping this going?
They agree that it should be renewed for 5 years. They disagree on how to fund it. The Republicans say this needs to be paid for. They want to take the money out of the Affordable Care Act and out of Medicare. Democrats don't want to do that. This is purely, how are we going to fund this? They have not resolved it. They said it was okay to wait until December, but now, as you point out, if they end up waiting until January, kids are going to start being taken off the program.
So this is all part of the funding the funding problems that they face with the government funding running out on Friday, and they look like they're going to do a short term until January.
That's what it sounds like, but that could have serious ramifications for CHIP, which they've been saying, oh, nobody's going to lose coverage. States have plenty of money left over. Well, they're quickly spending up all the money that was left over.
Julie Rovner of Kaiser Health News, thanks for being with us.
My pleasure.
The fight against ISIS in Iraq was a years-long, brutal campaign. Now the toll taken by its most important battle is coming into detailed and horrific relief. Hari Srinivasan has that from New York.
The battle for Iraq's second largest city, Mosul, began in October of last year. This past July, the militants were finally routed, but at a devastating cost. Great swaths of the city lay in ruins, and thousands died, civilians, soldiers, and ISIS fighters. At that time, special correspondent Marcia Biggs was there for us, witnessing the grim search for the dead. Here's a short excerpt of a report she filed.
This is what so-called liberated Mosul looks and sounds like. In a small pocket of the old city, the war against ISIS seemingly ongoing. And this is the old city from ground level, a scene of utter devastation. Entire neighborhoods flattened by coalition airstrikes, leaving the few survivors to search for the remains of their loved ones. Bashar and Ali's families were together in this house hit by an airstrike 28 days ago. Ali names the dead one by one.
My mother, 3 brothers, 3 sisters, my father, 2 sisters-in-law, 2 nieces.
And you're the only one left from your family?
Yes.
What are you going to do now?
What can I do? I just want to take the bodies out and bury them.
That grim task of counting and burying the dead is now several months old, and the numbers of civilian dead is shocking. A new report from the Associated Press puts that toll right now between 9,000 and 11,000 killed in Mosul. The AP says roughly 1/3 were killed by the U.S.-led coalition or Iraqi forces. That's much higher than the coalition's official figure of 326 civilian deaths. For more on the AP's report, I'm joined now by one of its authors, Susanna George. Thanks for being with us. First, let's start with that number. How do we get such a big discrepancy? How did you go about counting it?
We spoke to half a dozen morgue and Ministry of Health officials in Mosul. We cross-referenced a number of different databases that were kept by independent organizations and non-governmental organizations, the United Nations, Amnesty International, and we pulled all these different lists together that we were able to get, lists of names of the dead or death tolls from the morgue. Some were handwritten on pieces of paper, and we cross-referenced them and were able to come up with that range from 9,000 to 11,000 civilians killed during the battle to retake Mosul. That's from October of 2016 until July of 2017 when the city was declared liberated.
So when these people at the morgue write down the name of a dead body, what do they say is the cause of death? And how do we figure out whether they were killed by ISIS or whether they were killed by airstrikes?
Well, that's something that we had to rely on the morgue officials' knowledge of the cause of death for the civilians the bodies that they brought into their office. They have a small office in eastern Mosul where they work out of. And they said that they made a judgment call for cause of death as the bodies came in. And the ones that they logged as killed by artillery or airstrikes, they were able to determine that by talking to family members who brought the dead into their office, and also by examining the body. Many of the bodies, they said, as the battle moved towards western Mosul, the vast majority of the bodies that they were receiving at that time, they described as the cause of death as simply that they were crushed from either an airstrike, artillery, or from an IS car bomb or explosives, caused the building to collapse on top of the civilians.
Give us some context of what was happening in March in that last surge. Was there an opportunity for coalition forces to recognize that there were going to be an increased number of civilian casualties?
Well, what we saw there at the end of February and early March was something that we had seen happen a few other times in the Mosul operation. It was as Iraqi forces were looking to speed up the progress on the ground to retake the city, there was a spike in civilian casualties. And most people know about it because of the March 17 coalition airstrike that resulted in more than 100 civilians dead. That's according to a Pentagon investigation into the incident. And when the reports of that incident began to surface in late March, the entire Mosul operation was put on hold for a few weeks. And coalition officials told us at that time that, and a diplomat who was present during those meetings told us at that time that they were looking to completely change the way that they were fighting the battle because the cost on civilian lives was too great. However, when we spoke to Iraqi officers on the ground who were actually leading the fight, they told us that they did not receive any lasting change in guidelines of how to call in airstrikes or how to carry out the fight on the ground from their perspective.
You know, a few months ago, we saw in Marsha's story people going out and burying the dead. And in your story, you show individuals that are going back and exhuming the bodies of their loved ones. What are they doing? Describe that.
Those were heart-wrenching scenes that we saw at the graveyards that are scattered around western Mosul. Families had to exhume the bodies of their loved ones in order to get a Ministry of Health death certificate. That's a piece of paper that would entitle them to benefits from the state if their loved one was a member of the police or of the Iraqi security forces. And the families who we spoke to in those graveyards said it was like reliving the tragedy of losing that loved one all over again, having to pull their body up from under the ground and having a Ministry of Health official or a morgue official examine it to corroborate what they believe was the cause of death for their loved one.
Well, one of the things that you point out in your reporting is that this is not anywhere close to a comprehensive number, that there are still mass graves where people haven't been identified, not to mention entire cities like Raqqa where it could be worse.
That there's thousands of people who are believed to be in these mass graves that are dotted around Mosul, the largest of which is just south of Mosul's western half, Khasfa. And it also, our toll also doesn't include the people who died who were not from Mosul. IS, as the caliphate, the physical caliphate collapsed, IS herded thousands of civilians with them into Mosul from neighboring provinces. If there was a civilian who was from a neighboring province, not from Nineveh province, which is where Mosul is located, their death wouldn't have been recorded in the morgue and Ministry of Health documents that we examined as part of this investigation. So this is very much a minimum. That range of 9,000 to 11,000 is, we believe, a minimum. There's still hundreds of people who are still believed to be buried under the rubble of the old city that endured some of the greatest destruction in the fight to retake the city.
All right, Susanna George of the Associated Press, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Stay with us. Coming up on the NewsHour, Miles O'Brien walks us through this year in science, and a Broadway musical that's already being considered an award contender. But first, the links between housing and health. A recent study found that African Americans who move to less segregated neighborhoods see significant improvements in their blood pressure. Previous research has also shown that children who move to more affluent neighborhoods are much healthier. Across the country, local leaders are responding to these findings by giving poor families more choices in where they live. Sarah Varney begins our report in St. Louis. And the story was produced in collaboration with our partner, Kaiser Health News.
You must disperse immediately. This is no longer a peaceful protest.
It's been 3 years since civil unrest erupted in Ferguson, Missouri.
We just said hands up, don't shoot.
Is that all you were saying?
That's all we were saying.
After a white police officer fatally shot Michael Brown, an unarmed black teenager. But for one family, those turbulent days have led to much quieter nights.
Hi, Jennifer. Good. How are you?
Jennifer Cummings moved in June into this government-subsidized apartment in the upscale St. Louis suburb of Chesterfield with her daughters Simone and Samara.
So this is an amazing new home. Yeah, this is it. And when did you move in?
The tidy rental is a calm, safe haven for the working single mother, closer to her job and better schools for her kids.
What's above your bed?
It's a world away from her old neighborhood near Ferguson.
They stole my children's clothes, shoes, jewelry.
During the 4 years she lived here, burglars broke in 4 times, including last Thanksgiving. And both Cummings' brother and the father of her children were shot and killed nearby.
I actually had someone drill nails in the door just to prevent people from coming in on me and my girls while we were sleeping.
Among the thorny questions a state-appointed panel known as the Ferguson Commission grappled with in the months following Michael Brown's death was the region's long history of housing segregation. Black residents in St. Louis remain largely concentrated in poor and violent neighborhoods, often in substandard homes. Those conditions fuel depression, childhood asthma, diabetes, and other health problems. One study, for example, found 1 in 3 children who live in high-poverty areas had elevated lead in their blood, which can permanently affect their development. Dr. Craig Pollack, a public health researcher at Johns Hopkins, says moving families to wealthier zip codes can improve their health, their education, even how long they live.
For adults, we know that having the chance to move to an opportunity neighborhood, a low-poverty neighborhood, is linked with having a lower chance of getting diabetes as well as a lower chance of being obese. We also know that for kids that have the chance to move to opportunity neighborhoods at a young age, that they tend to have higher incomes later on in life. They're also more likely to attend college.
80 people were blocked in by police on all sides, told to disperse without a route to disperse.
In St. Louis, Reverend Starsky Wilson, a Ferguson Commission co-chair, says it became clear the Housing Authority needed to intervene directly to allow black residents like Jennifer Cummings to overcome historical barriers designed to keep them out of white suburbs.
If we know that housing is the cornerstone for the building of wealth and that wealth and health are connected, then we've got to say that these things that have been orchestrated around community development or the lack thereof have absolutely decimated the health of black and brown communities.
This is what democracy looks like. Show them what a family looks like.
Amid continued protests in St. Louis earlier this year, the so-called Housing Mobility Program, paid for with federal dollars, began moving the first families who volunteered.
This may be a new effort here in the St. Louis region to help struggling families change what can feel like preordained outcomes for their lives. But it's an approach that's already shown some success in other racially segregated cities, including Baltimore, Dallas, and Chicago.
The weather couldn't be worse, but appreciate you making the trek out here.
On a blustery day in a public housing complex south of Chicago, an overflow crowd has come to learn how to sign up for a housing voucher program from counselor Nick Mathutis.
All of you are thinking about moving. All of you guys have, expressed interest in moving to a better neighborhood. What's important to you in your next community?
It had long been the case that federal rental subsidies, used by some 2 million U.S. households, didn't take into account the higher rents needed to live in more affluent neighborhoods. That meant poor families stayed put.
This should be.
In 2016, President Obama ordered the nation's largest cities to raise rental subsidies for voucher holders who wanted to move into so-called areas of opportunity, zip codes with low crime, high employment rates, and excellent schools. President Trump has since rolled back the mandatory rule, but Cook County and the city of Chicago are doing it anyway, in large part because of the promising health effects.
It shouldn't come as a surprise. If you are living in a low-crime neighborhood, coming from a high-crime neighborhood, your stress levels are going to go down. You don't have to worry about your kids being bullied on the streets. You don't have to worry about your kids being recruited by a gang. So what's going to
These information sessions are the first step for people like Tanisha Jones.
I'm living in Roseland, and since I've been there for 3 years, everybody on my block have gotten killed.
Yeah, it's time to get out.
Gotta go.
But uprooting their families is a big decision, and counselors meet one-on-one to consider practical concerns.
So what's childcare look like for your 2-year-old?
I utilize family for the most part.
Okay.
On their website, they had
families that do sign up often move to Chicago's affluent northwest suburbs. where a counselor helps each family settle in.
How's that going with school?
Everything with school is fine.
Meet their new landlord.
Hi, Vera. Hi, Brian.
And find the rhythms of their new life.
When I gave you the tenant handbook, this is just a copy.
Okay.
I'll let you kind of run through it here as we go.
It's a new life in Chicago's prosperous suburbs that seems almost unimaginable to Tanisha Jones, who wakes each morning on Chicago's South Side.
All of Illinois can't be like this.
So when you imagine moving to a place like Hoffman Estates or Schaumburg or one of these other areas, what do you imagine for your kids? What do you imagine your life will be like there?
Oh man, freedom.
Yeah.
Kids being able to be kids, go outside and play, and me not looking out the window or worrying about if it's going to be a drive-by or something dangerous to that effect.
How was your day?
Chanel Washington is now resettled in one of Chicago's upscale suburbs. Her son Timothy once had severe asthma that was triggered by mold in the carpet in her old, shoddy apartment. There were other problems, too. She told her kids the gunshots they heard at night were fireworks. In their new neighborhood, Washington and her kids can play outside.
Not too fast, Lily.
And after living here for just a few months, Timothy's asthma has cleared up.
He just had a wellness checkup with his doctor a couple of weeks ago, actually, and he's healthy, thank God.
Dr. Pollack says it's vital to measure health effects like these in a more concrete way. His research team in Baltimore is collecting air quality samples and cockroach and mouse allergens in the homes of families before and after they move, and then testing whether asthmatic children who move to new neighborhoods have fewer complications.
We've heard from a lot of families that their asthma symptoms are doing better, that their health has improved. And I really think it's important to try to quantify this, to make sure that we're understanding kind of what is an investment in housing and the opportunity to move to a different neighborhood mean for health.
But there are risks to moving families out of these neighborhoods.
I'm really stressed out, especially just sitting in traffic.
Back in St. Louis, Jennifer Cummings' new apartment is closer to her job and her older daughter's new school, but she hasn't been able to find affordable daycare nearby for Simone. So she spends hours driving back and forth in gridlock traffic. While the Ferguson Commission recommended better housing options for low-income families as one solution, some community activists, like Tia Bird, say plucking families out of poor neighborhoods can fuel urban decay.
It adds to the mass vacancy that already happens because of just general disinvestment and lack of access to funding. And when we do that, you sort of develop this narrative that you can throw away a community and you throw away a neighborhood, and that's not fair to the people that want to stay.
Simone, come on, good morning.
Jennifer Cummings can understand that argument, but she says she would have done anything to give her children a better life than they were living just months ago.
I want them to know that there's something else out there better than what you see, that what's around you, what you've been through. I just want, them to see and experience something better. And so I would do it all again. It's dark.
Even if that means waking before dawn to drive across town and doing it all again tomorrow. For the PBS NewsHour and Kaiser Health News, I'm Sarah Varney.
It has been quite a year in the world of science. The headlines and images were powerful. Among them, the rupture of enormous icebergs, scientists taking to the streets, the solar eclipse that captured the attention of the country, and new insights into the workings of the universe. William Brangham sat down with Miles O'Brien to get some perspective on it all. It's part of our weekly segment, The Leading Edge.
So what would you say is the most important science story of the year?
I think there's little doubt, William, that the big science story of the year is a political story, sort of political science. Scientists concerned about the Trump administration and its climate denial or climate skepticism took to the streets. In April 22nd, Earth Day, thousands of them marched, concerned about the climate policy, but also environmental policies of the administration, also, frankly, concerned about their funding. And not long after the new administrator at the EPA came in, Scott Pruitt, a lot of evidence that they had reason to be concerned. There was a purge of scientists that received EPA funding, many of them associated with academic institutions, which made more room for corporate-sponsored science advising the Environmental Protection Agency. One of those purge scientists, Deborah Swackhammer from the University of Minnesota, told me she's really concerned about the precedent.
It almost feels like this is the first of a wave of potential actions that are going to further marginalize science advice and therefore marginalize the science being done at EPA, marginalize the science being done in other government agencies, and then ultimately there's going to be this very slow motion snowball effect.
And then the big worry. In June, President Trump into the Rose Garden announcing that the U.S., it is his decision for the U.S. to remove itself from the Paris Climate Accords. This is a big deal. 170 nations committing to limit greenhouse gas production to about 2 degrees of warming above industrial levels. The United States is the only nation that is not a party to Paris right now.
And this pushback and rejection of the climate science comes at a time when we seem to be getting more and more evidence of the severity of what climate change and global warming will do.
The evidence is stacking up. Climate change is not something of the future. It's happening now. We could talk about the wildfires in California right now. Certainly the hurricane season, epic, tragic, catastrophic in so many ways. In Puerto Rico, they're still trying to come back from that. Not only is there a lot of science linking the severity of these storms to climate change, they are, after all, fueled by warm water, but there is a lot of studies that indicate that there is increased precipitation that comes along with these storms. Look what we saw in Houston. I spoke with climate scientist at Columbia University, Radley Horton, about this.
Even if the hurricane strengths stay the same, we'll probably see more rainfall in those hurricanes in the future because the upper oceans are going to be warmer, because that warmer atmosphere can hold more moisture. That means that even if the storm's strength is the same, you'll probably see a little more rainfall occurring during those powerful hurricanes.
There was other evidence as well. In April, there was a very significant coral bleaching event in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia that scientists said had clear-cut signs that climate change was a factor. Warm water affects the coral in very significant ways. And then in July, one of the biggest icebergs ever seen was created. The Larsen Sea ice shelf fell off of Antarctica into the sea. Glaciologist Kelly Brunt gave us some perspective on it.
Losing ice that represents roughly the state of Rhode Island in a month and a half just far exceeded anybody's expectations of what could happen and the time scale that it could happen in.
So it was kind of like we have to rethink things here a little bit. I mean, this was a wake-up call.
This was absolutely a wake-up call.
Another concern that scientists have been raising repeatedly is the threat of superbugs. These are bacteria that have not only developed some ability to fight back against our best antibiotics, but some of them are wholly resistant to those antibiotics.
It's really a big problem. 23,000 Americans now die each year because there are no antibiotics to help them. And very simple infections can kill you without antibiotics. The World Health Organization came out with a landmark study this year indicating this is of grave concern, and there have to be some incentives put in place to find new antibiotics.
Financial incentives.
It's difficult because of the way antibiotics are prescribed. There's not a lot of money in it for the big pharma companies. And scientists, frankly, are running out of the low-hanging fruit, the microbes that are there that make it possible to make antibiotics. But this is a big concern which we need to be watching.
And one of the biggest science events of the year certainly was the eclipse. We loved watching your coverage of that wonderful event. That
Wish you could have been there, pal.
That was big news. And then there was other news of the heavens. Tell us about that.
Well, the eclipse was, it was great. I've been covering science for a long time. I once saw an annular eclipse, which allows a little ring of the sun to still exist. But this was a full eclipse. I happened to be in the path of totality. I was prepared to be blasé. And I've got to tell you, William, next time they come around, make sure you find yourself to one of these spots. It's really a great experience in the sense that it gives us understanding of how much we know about the space and astronomy, and yet how insignificant we are in some ways. There's a certain dichotomy there. And maybe we're not so alone. In February, the European Southern Observatory announced it had found a very Earth-like looking system, the so-called TRAPPIST system, has 7 planets around it, has a lot of indications that they might be Earth-like. Let's listen to one of the scientists, Thomas Zurbuchen.
What you can see in this illustration is that 3 of these planets, marked in green, are in the habitable zone, where liquid water can pool on the surface. In fact, with the right atmospheric conditions, there could be water on any of these planets.
And as you know, William, on this planet, where you find liquid water, you always find life. So that is a tantalizing clue. Scientists haven't figured that one out yet. Now, for the big scientific, purely scientific event of the year, you have to look at the collision of two neutron stars that was recorded in two novel ways, capturing their gravitational waves as well as traditional astronomy. Scientists had not witnessed one of these collisions of these very dense neutron stars. Why is that significant? Well, understanding it using both gravitational waves and traditional light astronomy gave them a way of further calibrating a lot of what Einstein first told us about the expansion of the universe. They also theorized that these collisions are what created a lot of the heavy elements, including gold and platinum, for example. Scientists estimated that this collision generated more than $1 octillion worth of gold. That's one with 27 zeros. The problem is it's about 130 million light years away, so the prospects, if you will, are not so great. The scientists, however, that are responsible for this are the odds-on favorite down the road to win a Nobel Prize, William.
Miles O'Brien, such fascinating stuff. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Finally tonight, a small musical that has become a hit of this Broadway season, an early favorite for the Tony Awards, and based on some unusual source material. Jeffrey Brown has the story.
Let me tell you about Petah Tikva, such a city everybody loves it.
When the members of the Alexandria, Egypt ceremonial band arrive in Israel for a performance, it's immediately clear something is wrong. They were expected in the city of Petah Tikva with a P.
Not a fun, not a art, not a culture, this is Petah Tikva with a B.
But through a mistranslation, they've come to the sleepy desert town of Betah Tikva with a B, where Dina, owner of the One Tiny Cafe, lets them know there's not a lot going on.
Welcome to nowhere.
The new musical, The Band's Visit, set in 1996, is about missed opportunities, crossed signals, little and big things like love that do and more often don't happen. And it's connecting with audiences and critics alike. The New York Times called it a musical for grown-ups.
What is he thinking? What does he wish for?
At Sardi's restaurant in Times Square, we talked with members of the production team, including actress Katrina Lenk, who stars as Dina.
I think it's about loneliness and our choice to remain lonely or to not be lonely when an opportunity comes around. It's about taking little risks, and it's also about how music and art are bigger connectors than just language alone.
The story unfolds in one night as the hapless band, looking as one character says, like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, gets stuck in town. And the equally hapless locals take them into their homes and lives.
My wife has birthday today. Oh.
Without a shared language, communication is in broken English.
Many happy years.
Thank you.
And beautiful music. It's based on a 2007 film without music of the same name that writer Itamar Moses adapted to the stage.
Absolutely everything that happens is just a very, very gentle, natural outcropping of that very basic situation. And yet, by the end of the movie, you feel like something really important and sort of life-changing has happened for these people. So I thought that was really sort of profound and interesting, and I thought it would be cool to try to see if you could preserve that in a different form.
I don't know with the girls, I don't know.
Turning the story into a musical and deciding when a song is best for capturing a moment fell to composer David Yazbek.
You know, a song in a musical can serve a lot of different purposes, and if you're adapting from a movie, sometimes the song is like a close-up in a movie. You might close up on someone's face and get the picture speaks 1,000 words. Music does the same thing.
Friday evening, oh my chérie.
song can also just be a way of going much deeper into a character or a relationship. You know, that's the other thing that we were exploring in this.
The relationship that could happen is between Dina and Tufik, the straight-laced but deeply humane leader of the Egyptian band, played by Tony Shalhoub.
Sunday morning, her voice would fill our living room.
In the show's signature ballad titled Omar Sharif, Katrina Lenk as Dina sings of how much she loved Egyptian movies and music as a young Israeli girl.
I'm just overjoyed that I get to sing such a beautiful song and that people do seem to be responding to it in a way that they love it maybe as much as I do. That's a really exciting, special experience to have.
Several cast members and writers visited Israel before the production to see the real town on which the story is based. They knew a tale of Israelis and Egyptians comes with plenty of historical and political freight, and decided, as in the film, to focus on the smaller human scale within the larger drama.
I wouldn't say that it's accurate to say that the show's not political. I think it's enormously political, but the argument it's making is about the sort of man-made arbitrariness of politics, and that in the absence of those imaginary structures, people connect over all kinds of things.
One of the charms of the production, directed by David Cromer, several members of the Alexandria Ceremonial Band are actually in the theatrical band. They're musicians as well as actors, including violinist George Aboud, who brings something else to the performance. As an Arab American from Detroit, he hopes the music, the play, and his presence in it makes a larger statement.
Growing up, you don't have much to go with as a young Arabic kid, and much to go with in seeing yourself represented in performing arts. That's why a lot of Arabic kids don't become actors, because they don't think of it something for them, and then also their families don't think of it something for them. So I think if there was more stories being told and they were being welcomed more into the theater by their stories being regularized or their actors getting to be part of these shows, that the kids would be like, oh, that's another option for me. It's just a way to open up the world a little bit.
Spelling out the rhythm of love.
And just another way that makes the band's visit an unusual and welcome addition to Broadway this season. For the PBS NewsHour, I'm Jeffrey Brown in New York.
And proof that Broadway keeps turning out such great material. And that is the NewsHour for tonight. I'm Judy Woodruff. Join us online and again here tomorrow evening. For all of us at the PBS NewsHour, thank you, and we'll see you soon. So you don't think the Senate Majority Leader McConnell will have to resort to the so-called nuclear option?
Last year, you seemed to be reluctant to get involved or to intervene in Syria directly. Is that one thing that's changed after yesterday?
But you're saying this really does have a major impact on the species that live here.
You're watching PBS.